All right, students, welcome. The purpose of this first presentation is really to kind of try to paint the context and overview of the kind of the theoretical framework for the course. So in the future when I do the live sessions, it'll be one part content lecture, one part discussion of assignments, one part discussing what you want to ask me about such that you have any questions. But for today, since this is the first presentation that I'm doing without an audience, and I'm really, I have the objective of trying to frame the course in a way that can be understandable to you. This will be a little bit different than the other sessions are going to be. In this session will be more content driven, but at any rate, context and content is what I'm after for the session for today. I know a lot of you probably entered the course, you see the word ethics, and what comes to mind is, for example, a code of ethics for educators, a list of do's, but more often than not, a list of don't do this, don't do that, and you're thinking of ethics in those terms. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of that is a part of this course because there are professional codes of ethics that would be our responsibility to at least include in this class, but it's a much broader view of ethics and morality than that limited view of just thinking of it in terms of a code of ethics, but I'll get to that in a moment. So I'm trying to perhaps broaden your thinking in terms of what we're going to be addressing in this course. It's a lot more than looking at the Georgia Code of Ethics for educators. Starrett is one of our references and experts we're going to use for a lot of the course. He's clearly considered one of the most profound thinkers in this regard, but I think this is a good starting place for us, again, to try to envision what we are addressing in this course. In terms of ethical responsibilities that we all have, we have responsibilities as a human being toward one another. We have certain responsibilities as a citizen, and also because we're educators, I think nearly all of us are, we have some responsibility as a public servant. We serve the public as an educator. We have our responsibilities because we are educators. We have our responsibilities that are unique to us as educational administrators, and then we have our responsibilities, I'm separating this, as an educational leader. This really increases the responsibility and specializes the responsibilities as you move down the rung, because the educational leader still has their responsibilities as an administrator, as an educator, as a public servant, as a citizen, as a human being. So, for example, as a school leader, you are responsible to do your due diligence to support all of the children in your school and to be fair to all the children in your school. And you have responsibilities to the teachers. You have responsibilities to the parents. You have responsibility to the community. So in some sense, there's a professional ethical responsibility that grows as we assume these professional positions of great responsibility. Education is important to the future of every child in your school, so therefore you have and bear a responsibility, a high level of responsibility, a high deal of ethical responsibility to all the children in your school. So again, let's keep trying to keep our mind open here to what we might be looking at in this course. Another way to look at this, there's a moral element to this course, and I know that brings to mind a religious aspect for many of us, and certainly there's a religious component historically and in the present to the whole idea of morals, but in this context, moral leadership, we're talking about because relationships are so critical, how we treat one another, whether it's an administrator's relationship with a teacher or an administrator's relationship with a parent or an administrator's relationship with the students. That's the center of the work of school leaders, and that makes it a moral activity to the extent that you have responsibilities to one another based upon your professional, moral kind of relationship, to try to listen, to be open-minded, to be fair, those kinds of things. I would argue, and the literature supports the idea that those are examples of the context for moral leadership. And I would also suggest, looking at the last bullet point here, to what ends and by what means are you going to lead and teach? Obviously, there are probably moral limits that we should not go beyond in terms of trying to accomplish a certain end or aim. And certainly, I'm not sure who the philosopher is who talks about the end justifies the means. Maybe that's Hobbes. I can't remember. My mind is going blank. But the point is, you can't necessarily, or maybe you shouldn't just justify doing whatever it takes to accomplish a certain thing that's important to you. So when you think about your responsibilities as a leader and as a teacher, there are limits to how far you want to go. For example, you wouldn't torture a student using the means of torture in order to try to get the student to behave. That would be going too far. So as an administrator, as a leader, you're constantly struggling to probably determine how far you can go in certain areas to try to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. These are all examples of moral leadership that isn't necessarily have a religious kind of an overtone to it. Another way to look at the context of this course, if you go back to 1965, the Gross and Harriet work, it's really probably the first work where there was an effort made to make some relationship between the staff's morale and the professional performance of teachers and whether students learn, and there was an effort to try to connect that to what kind of leadership was going on, executive professional leadership. So, for example, if you treat your teachers fairly and respectfully, does their morale go up, does their performance go up, and then in turn, do the students learn more? So whatever that is, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, I guess, researchers started looking at this question as far as for leaders, and this is, again, having leaders act ethically and morally in the way they relate and have relationships with their staff. And I also think we need to mention the historic work of Burns in 1978. Almost any textbook on leadership is going to mention Burns' work, and he really came up with this idea of a leader who transforms, making a profound difference as a leader, creating new structures, and not just managing the present, but it has a futuristic, idealistic notion to it. And according to Burns' work, and he's really the first that coined this transformational kind of terminology, when a leader considers what people want and what they need and the aspirations of the people that they're working with and the values of the people that they're working with, that would be what would be considered moral leadership, whereas somebody who was amoral or immoral as a leader wouldn't give a hoot for what people wanted or what they needed or what they aspired to or what their values were. So the higher calling or the aspirational, transformational kind of leadership would be considered the moral leadership, and I think most leaders would want to be considered a moral leader in this regard, one who considers those important areas to the people who are working with them and for them. It's important to try to give just a definition for values. I think the basic definition would be when you make judgments, when you select preferences, when you make choices, those are the reflections of your values. You're picking and judging and preferring and choosing based upon your set of beliefs, your set of values. And I think any of you who are a practicing administrator currently can certainly attest to how often you have an interplay of these values. Your own personal values might be against something or have you to do something or not do something that perhaps a school policy requires you to do. And I gave an example here of zero tolerance. We all know that a zero tolerance policy would be something like any student who gets caught with a weapon, doesn't matter the circumstances, they're automatically expelled. That would be an example of a zero tolerance policy that may well conflict with your values. You may think there are things that should be considered or part of the decision-making process in terms of how that situation is handled, but you may be working in a school that has a zero tolerance policy. So the administrator, the leader here, is caught between their own personal values of wanting to do what's right, to take into the context, to consider the situation as contrasted with the policy of the school, which says you don't consider any of those things, you simply expel the student for violating the weapons procedure. So again, we see where the values of the individual administrator clearly create conflicts or interplay when they run into and they create moral dilemmas when a school policy is contrary to a personal value structure. So here's an important slide back to where I started this conversation. Many of you are probably thinking of this course as being general ethics, the whole idea of every day, we try to live more honorably, to be more kind, we follow the 10 Commandments, for example, listing of codes of conduct, which we certainly have codes of conduct for educators. We're talking about a lot more, and we're going to try to develop this course as being much more than just general ethics. It's importantly about applied ethics, which I would also call professional ethics, where we have responsibilities, we as leaders have responsibilities to serve the good of our clients, in this case, our students. We have the importance of our integrity of our work in the context of our work, and we have responsibilities to our teachers and students and parents and community. For example, listening or having an open mind would be examples of applied ethics in a professional context that go beyond the basic general kind of code of ethics that says, don't do something naughty. So we're really dealing with more in a larger sense. We want to develop this whole notion of applied ethics in the professional context. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but here's some examples, I think, of professional ethics would be in action when you have a leader that realizes they do have a higher standard they're called to, and they have a responsibility to do more than just collect a paycheck or just get by every day. There's a professional ethical responsibility to do more than just get through the day. There's also another way to look at it, a higher moral standard to be proactive to make sure that we have quality of learning for all students. You can't just work with the gifted students, or you can't just work with the disabled students. You as a leader have an ethical responsibility to all the children that are entrusted to your care. And this is all from Starrett, for example. And another thing that I think probably we all would agree with is that you need a moral passion to really be effective in this. And again, maybe you want to call it an ethical passion. But again, learning needs to be authentic and real for all students. We have a lot of students that we know that the curriculum is not relevant to them, or they feel it's not relevant, or they don't feel connected to the curriculum. They don't feel the curriculum is authentic. So kind of in an instructional leadership capacity, I think you can easily make the argument that there's an ethical responsibility for a leader to work with a passion to make sure that the curriculum is in fact making the authentic connections to the students to make the learning to be relevant and real. Another example that we've already touched on, just to mention again, where you get caught in a two-way responsibility, you may have district policies that you are required to follow through with, like a zero tolerance policy would be example. And at the same time, you might have and do have perhaps an equal responsibility to point out perhaps to a supervisor when you believe a policy is harming children or is not meeting the objectives that it purportedly does. So there really is a responsibility to follow policy and also a responsibility to call into attention policies that perhaps are not serving their intended purposes. Again, a little more structure to what we're talking about as far as a moral dilemma. Again, there's a religious history and connotation to this, but it is also more than just a religious kind of a frame of reference. Making sure you do the right thing, not the most expedient or easiest path. That's a moral dilemma for leaders, to make sure that they are going through a process that gets them out on the other end of the process to feeling like they've done the right thing or they've done the fair and just thing. And if you're a leader who is working through some moral dilemmas in a decision-making process, you ought to be thinking about things like what's right, what ought I do, what's the just thing to do, what's the fair thing to do. Those kinds of conversations with yourself are indicative of a moral dilemma that you are working through. And again, just to characterize what we've already said, we as leaders have duties and obligations to one another, and also a responsibility to ensure fair treatment for one another, and a responsibility to be sensitive and aware of rights that we have toward one another. So again, we're talking about a conduct of professional behavior here, of ethical behavior, that goes a lot more beyond just following a basic code of professional behaviors. Here's some example of decision making, and one of the things we're going to emphasize in the course is a good way to make decisions in these difficult moral or conflicting kind of situations. But it's very common to have moral sentiments conflict. And when you get to that point of having a conflict, I think it's very helpful for you to have some idea about what your priorities are, also your values, and how you might justify your own personal principles and the principles that you might ascertain as being part of the moral dilemma. So having some ability to look at the situation in terms of prioritization, which carries the greater weight, which principle maybe has a higher weight, would be a part of thinking about how to work through a moral decision process. And obviously, it would be important for you to express and clarify those principles that you believe are important, because that helps keep you grounded in what you're actually doing or thinking you're working through. And of course, it would be important for you to determine which facts are most relevant to the situation. So part of this moral decision making is about weighing these facts out and these principles out, principles of fairness, for example, and trying to prioritize them so that you can feel good that even though you had a difficult decision to make, you were able to balance it out in a way that ethically makes sense. Some other things that would be part of a decision-making process would be for you to make sure you base your decision on principles, not just on a whim. Make sure you're considering the welfare and interests of everybody who's affected by the decision. That would be an ethical decision-making process. Making sure you use the most complete information possible. That would be an ethical decision-making process. And really trying to answer the question about what ought I do is another way to think about working through a decision-making process in an ethical way. This comes from Schrag. Another way for you to look at this, again, in terms of working through ethical decision processes from Bottery in '92, does the decision that you're looking at, does it treat people as ends in themselves or as a means to an end? In other words, are you taking into consideration that these are human beings, that these decisions are going to affect human beings? If so, that's a more ethical aspect of a decision-making process. Does your process assume that human beings are resources that you just need to manipulate them however you need to, or again, similar to number 2, are you taking into consideration that individual, that human being as an individual, what he or she wants? You can't always do what they want, but are you giving it due consideration, or are you simply doing the most expedient bottom line type of decision-making process? And then I guess I'm skipping obviously every other one of these because I don't need to discuss every one to you right now at this point, but another way to look at this is, does the decision-making process really show a value or appreciation for those individuals? Or again, does it look at those individuals as just an element that is part of the organization, and you're as a leader and you have the authority, so therefore you can simply manipulate, or manipulate's probably a strong word, you can just make the decision without respect to the needs, wants, aspirations of those individuals. If you do that, obviously that would not be a particularly ethical approach to making that decision. Finally, as we start to kind of wind this down as the last slide for today, and I know that I threw a lot at you, but really what I've been trying to get at is for you to see the dimension of what we're talking about in terms of ethical leadership is much more than following a basic code of ethical conduct. And again, borrowing from Starrett here, what we have, I think this helps to end our conversation for today. If you're aspiring to be a strong ethical decision maker, a strong ethical leader, these would be some of the characteristics that we might see you feeling very comfortable doing, or you doing very regularly and as a part of your normal practice. Do you have good working relationships with teachers and support staff? For example, do you respect them? Do you have trust in them? Are you gentle and firm in your leadership? Those would probably be descriptors that we would think of as moral kind of leadership, ethical kind of leadership. Do you have good working relations with each student? Remember, the students are our clients, if you want to think of it that way, and there's an ethical, moral responsibility to each of those children. You're the adult with the responsibility, the knowledge, the skill, the wherewithal. You have an ethical obligation to those students. Are you able, this is starting to get to the instructional side, are you able to connect the curriculum essentially to the student's sense of identity? Starrett talks a lot about developing a curriculum that essentially allows every student to engage, regardless of their background and their diversity status, having a curriculum that is meaningful and is a place where all students can feel connected. And related to that also is really under number 4 here is an instructional kind of a leadership. Do you as a leader cultivate that sense of having students participate, find their place in the world, and that the material being studied is really real to them, and they see their participation in the world as vital, and they see that they have goals and aspirations to accomplish in this world. So these last two are a lot, perhaps, more related to an instructional leadership role, in this case really in terms of curriculum and what is being taught, but also I would argue they might be more challenging because they really, you can stand for these things as a leader, but you also are going to need to help create conditions and expectations where teachers and others who are charged with carrying out the curriculum and developing the curriculum and developing instruction also are able to buy into or own these types of approaches as being their ethical responsibility as classroom instructors. So What I've intended to do today was to introduce you to the broad range of what we're going to be addressing in this course. I hope you're going to find it to be a reasonable mix of some theory, some practicality, a reasonable workload, a reasonable reading load. I have high expectations for all of us, including myself. In the future, when I do these discussions live, I will do less lecturing, although I will discuss some of the content for certain. I'll also be discussing assignments that are forthcoming, and I'll be responding to student questions. So when these are done in the future, I intend to do 4 of these live. You'll be able to participate live, or you're welcome to watch the recording, which is available immediately after the session. And one other thing I would say, it is expected that the material that's discussed in these live sessions will be evident in your case study work and also in your other 3 assignments for the course. But again, appreciate your attention to this. Welcome to the course, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you.